They say the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. 3 years ago, I learned just how true that was when my own father threw me to the streets with nothing but the clothes on my back and a legacy I no longer wanted. He thought that by stripping away my name and my bank accounts, he was stripping away my power. He didn't realize that by discarding Leo at the same time, he gave me the only partner I ever needed. We didn't cry, we didn't beg. Instead, we went underground. While our families celebrated our supposed failure, we spent every waking hour in a cramped studio, building a multi-billion-dollar shadow conglomerate. For 3 years, we've been the invisible ghost in their boardrooms, the silent buyer of their debts, and the architects of their coming ruin. They think we're broken outcasts, but today they're going to find out that the heirs they disowned now own every brick of the empires they built. This isn't just a takeover, it's a reckoning. Our families owned the skyline. I don't say that as a metaphor. I say that as a literal, documented, tax-assessed fact. The Weston name, my name, the name I was born into, the name that was supposedly encoded into my very purpose for existing, was carved into the glass facades of 43 buildings in this city alone, not counting the offshore holdings, not counting the subsidiaries nested inside subsidiaries like Russian dolls made of money and legacy and 100-year-old agreements written in ink that smelled like power. And then there was Ethan Ashford, the other half of what the business press once called the most consequential pairing of inherited wealth in modern financial history. His family didn't own the skyline. His family financed it. While Weston's built, Ashford's funded the building. 2 dynasties in perfect, mutually beneficial orbit for 3 generations. Our grandfathers had shaken hands on a terrace in Geneva. Our fathers had co-signed restructuring deals that saved entire industries. And Ethan and I, the golden heirs, the future faces of that orbit, had been positioned since childhood to seal it all together in the cleanest, most legacy-affirming way possible. They just never specified how they expected us to be together. That part, apparently, was non-negotiable. I've thought about that night so many times that the memory has worn grooves into me, like water cutting through stone over the years. The detail I always return to first isn't the argument, it isn't my father's face, it's the table. We were in the east drawing room of the Weston estate, the one with the 18-foot ceilings and the Flemish oil portraits of dead ancestors staring down from every wall, and the dining table was set for a formal dinner that we never sat down to eat. White linen, crystal glasses catching candlelight, a centerpiece of white peonies that someone had spent a considerable amount of time arranging. Someone had cared about that centerpiece. And by the end of that night, none of it would matter. We had agreed, Ethan and I, after months of private debate, after lying awake in the dark talking in whispers about every possible scenario, that we would be honest, that we would stand in front of both families, the Westons and the Ashfords, assembled together, as they so often were for the quarterly family dinners that doubled as board strategy sessions, and we would tell them the truth. Not a performance, not a careful, legally worded disclosure, the truth. That we were in love. That it hadn't started as anything planned, that somewhere in the years of being raised in parallel, of being groomed for the same future from opposite sides of the same industry, we had looked at each other and recognized something that had nothing to do with boardrooms or bloodlines, that we were each other's, completely, and that we wanted to build our future together, not as strategically aligned heirs, but as partners in every sense of the word. I remember the silence after I spoke. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. I counted. Then my father stood up. I will not reproduce what he said, because some words are not worth the oxygen they require and are certainly not worth the permanence of repetition. What I will tell you is the architecture of it, the clinical, devastating precision of it. He did not shout. Men like my father do not shout. Shouting implies a loss of control, and Reginald Weston had never lost control of anything in his life, which was precisely what made him so dangerous. He spoke in the same measured boardroom cadence he used when dismissing underperforming executives. Calm, deliberate, final. He used the word stain. He said I was a stain on a 100-year-old name. He said it once, quietly, and then he picked up his wine glass and took a slow sip as though he had simply noted a minor inconvenience, as though I were a watermark on the crystal that he would have someone polish out in the morning. Ethan's mother was different. She didn't use language at all. She simply looked at Ethan, her firstborn, her heir, the boy she had dressed in tiny suits since age 3 for photo opportunities, and she pressed her lips together in an expression I can only describe as total erasure, as though she were watching him cease to exist in real time. And then she nodded, once to the head of estate security who had apparently been pre-briefed because he moved immediately and without hesitation. They had prepared. That's what I understood in that moment. They had prepared for this, which meant they had known or suspected and had chosen this theater of controlled cruelty over a private conversation, over mercy, over the basic human grace of treating their children like people who deserved a dialogue. I watched 2 security personnel take Ethan's arms. He didn't fight them. He just looked at me, and his eyes said everything his voice didn't need to. He was steady. He was frightened beneath it. I could see it in the slight tension at the corner of his jaw, the way he pressed his lips together exactly the way he always does when he is refusing to let something show. But he was steady because I was in the room, and that has always been the mathematics of us. We are steady when we can see each other. They let him out first. I watched him go, and something happened in my chest that I don't have a clean word for. It wasn't quite grief, it was closer to the feeling of a load-bearing wall being removed from a structure. The sudden understanding that something you assumed was permanent had just demonstrated that it wasn't. Then my father gestured toward the door. I walked out on my own. I want that noted. I walked out of the Weston estate under my own power, past the ancestors in their oil portraits and the uneaten dinner and the white peonies, and I did not look back. Not because I wasn't devastated. Because if I looked back at my father's face in that moment, I was afraid of what I would feel. Not anger, not even sadness. I was afraid I would feel nothing, and that the nothing would be worse than all of it. They had one security officer escort me to the gate. He handed me, wordlessly, a single leather bag that someone had packed while we were in the drawing room. Pre-packed, again, prepared. Inside it was a change of clothes, a toiletry kit, and my personal laptop. Not my work laptop, that was company property, which I no longer have. Not my phone, that was on the family plan, which I no longer had access to. My personal laptop, a 3-year-old machine I used for non-work reading and the occasional film. They had stripped everything else already. My access cards, my corporate accounts, my driver, my car. The gate clicked shut behind me. Ethan was standing on the street outside the Ashford estate, which was 2 blocks north. He had been delivered there. We had been processed at separate locations like a corporate restructuring, 2 redundant assets cleared simultaneously to avoid complications. He was standing in the dark in his dinner jacket with a similar bag at his feet, and when I came around the corner and saw him, he looked up, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he picked up his bag. I picked up mine, and we walked. We had, between us, the cash in our physical wallets, less than $400 combined, because men raised the way we were raised did not carry cash. 2 personal laptops, the clothes on our backs, and approximately 40 years of combined knowledge about how the most powerful financial machinery in the country actually operated from the inside. They thought they were sending us out with nothing. They were sending us out with everything. We just didn't know it yet. The studio apartment was on the 6th floor of a building in a part of the city where our family's names were never spoken in, not because it was dangerous, but simply because it was ordinary. And ordinary was the one thing our families had spent generations insulating themselves from. The elevator didn't work. The heating was inconsistent. The window in the main room looked out onto the brick wall of the adjacent building, close enough that if someone in those offices had leaned out their window and we'd leaned out ours, we could have shaken hands. We paid for the first month with the cash from our wallets and what Ethan had managed to transfer in the 40-minute window between when his mother nodded at security and when his accounts were frozen. He'd seen it coming. He'd been calmer about the possibility than I had, which was a function of his nature. Ethan processes fear by preparing for the outcome he doesn't want, while I process it by refusing to believe the outcome is possible. Together, those two approaches make something surprisingly functional. The transfer was enough for the deposit and the first month. After that, we had 17 days. I want to be very precise about what the first year actually looked like, because it has been simplified in subsequent retellings, mostly by financial journalists who discovered the arc of our story after the takeover and ran breathless retrospectives full of words like phoenix and vengeance and rags to riches, which is technically inaccurate since we had never been in rags and we were certainly not starting from nothing, but nuance does not sell magazine covers. The reality was slower and uglier and more exhausting than any of those retrospectives captured. The first problem was identity. Without our family names as active endorsements, our personal credentials were paradoxically weaker than they would have been for someone with no famous name at all, because every institution we approached, every bank, every early-stage investment firm, every angel network, every accelerator, already knew exactly who we were, and the knowing was the problem. To them, we weren't Carter Weston and Ethan Ashford, two exceptionally qualified financial architects with 2 decades of inside knowledge about how the top tier of global capital actually moved. We were the disowned heirs, the fallen, the cautionary tale. I still remember the first meeting we got. It was with a regional investment firm, a small operation, nothing our families would have ever bothered to acknowledge, and I thought that their relative distance from our family's orbit would mean they'd evaluate us on our actual merits. The partner across the table was pleasant enough for the first 10 minutes. Then he asked why we'd left our family firms. We told a version of the truth that there had been an irreconcilable personal conflict with senior leadership, which was technically accurate, and I watched his expression recalibrate in real time. He knew. Of course he knew. In the circles that matter, everything is known within 72 hours. The story of the Weston and Ashford disownments had circulated through every financial network in the country before our feet were dry from the rain that night. And to those networks, the disownment wasn't just personal drama, it was a signal. It said, these men could not maintain the most fundamental relationship in their world, the one with their own families. What does that say about their reliability as partners? That meeting ended in 11 minutes. We had 47 more like it over the next 8 months. Some of them were worse. There was one investor who let us get all the way through a 40-minute presentation, a genuinely sophisticated proposal for a restructured holding vehicle that I remain proud of to this day, and then told us that he couldn't in good conscience associate his firm with individuals whose ethics were so unclear. When I asked him to clarify what ethics he was referring to, he looked pointedly between Ethan and me, and I understood. He was not talking about our business ethics, he was talking about us, about what we were to each other. Ethan put his hand on my arm under the table at that moment, just his fingers on my forearm, steady pressure. He has always known when I'm about to say something that, while satisfying in the immediate moment, would create problems in the subsequent ones. I said nothing. We gathered our materials. We left. Outside on the street, Ethan exhaled slowly and tipped his head back toward the sky for a moment, and I watched the deliberate way he released the tension from his shoulders, and I thought, I am going to build something so vast that every closed door we have walked away from today will one day be a room we own. I didn't say that out loud. I held it. To survive financially in the interim, we did things I had never done in my life. Ethan took freelance financial consulting work under a name that wasn't his, a legal intermediary he set up carefully, not as a deception, but as a necessary insulation from the baggage of our surnames. I did analytical work for a boutique data firm that didn't ask where I'd gone to school because their clients didn't care about pedigree. They cared about accuracy. We billed by the hour. We were paid by direct deposit into accounts we had opened with clean credentials. The money was enough to live on, barely. The studio apartment became the center of our entire world, not just our home, but our office, our conference room, our research library, our kitchen, our bedroom. Everything happened in approximately 400 square feet. The desk we bought secondhand was permanently covered in overlapping papers and open laptops. We ate at the coffee table because the desk was never clear. We slept on a bed that was too small for 2 adults, which neither of us ever complained about because neither of us would have wanted more distance. The deprivation was real. I'm not going to romanticize it because that would be dishonest. There were nights when the weight of what we'd walked away from, or been thrown out of, depending on how you frame it, sat so heavily that I couldn't sleep. Lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling, while Ethan's breathing beside me was the only thing that kept the spiral from swallowing me whole. There were mornings when I opened my laptop to check our bank balance and then closed it again because I needed 30 seconds of not knowing before I could face the number. But we never broke, and we never, not once, in 12 months of rejection and financial suffocation and systematic dismissal by every institution we had once been raised to believe we would lead, we never turned that weight on each other. That, I think, was the thing they had not accounted for. Our families had assumed that exile would separate us, that the removal of comfort and resources and status would reveal the relationship to be a luxury, something we could afford to feel when everything else was provided, but not something that could survive scarcity. They had treated our love as a side effect of privilege. They were spectacularly wrong. I should tell you about the mornings, because the mornings are the part that nobody writes about, and the part that I will carry with me for the rest of my life as the clearest evidence that what Ethan and I have is not a story of survival or ambition or revenge. It is, at its core, a story about two people who were each other's only home and what they built when every other home was taken. In the estate, I had never paid attention to mornings. They were managed. Coffee at a temperature I had specified to staff, a schedule that had been prepared the night before, a sequence of obligations that began before I was fully awake and carried me through until I collapsed at night. I had never experienced a morning that was simply mine to move through slowly. In the studio apartment, mornings were slow by necessity. We had no staff, no schedule that someone else had built for us, no car waiting downstairs. We had 2 mugs, a single-cup coffee machine we'd found at a thrift store, and each other. Ethan wakes before I do. I don't know if he has always been this way or if it was something the exile created, some vigilance born of the experience of losing everything overnight. But every morning, I would surface from sleep to find him already awake, lying on his side facing me, often reading something on his phone or simply lying there in the gray early light with that expression he gets when he's thinking deeply, slightly inward, jaw soft, the particular stillness of a mind that never actually stops but sometimes slows to something that looks like peace. And every single morning, the first thing he did when he noticed my eyes open was smile. Not a performance of a smile, not the careful, curated expression he wore for the world outside. His actual smile, which is smaller and slower than people would expect from a man as precisely composed as Ethan Ashford, and which reaches his eyes in a way that I am convinced is physically impossible for him to manufacture, like something just slightly too real to control. "You're still here," he said once, in the early months. Just that, quietly, like he was confirming something he'd been afraid to assume. I reached over and pressed my hand flat against his chest, over his heartbeat, and I held it there. I didn't answer because the answer was in my hand. I am here. I am here. I am not going anywhere. What happened to us in that year, in that apartment, in the relentless intimacy of having nowhere else to be and no one else who wanted us? It was not what our families had intended. They had intended the exile to be a diminishment, an unmaking. Strip a man of his name and his money and his platform, and what is he? They had an answer for that question, and the answer was nothing. But they had removed everything except Ethan, and Ethan was the one variable they had never properly accounted for. I had been physically affectionate with him long before the disownment. There had been stolen hours in his apartment across town, weekends when we had the excuse of a project or a meeting that ran long, an entire architecture of small deceptions we'd maintained for almost 2 years before we decided we were done hiding. But that physical ease, that particular fluency in each other's bodies, not in a way that demanded anything, but in the way that two people develop when they know each other deeply enough to use touch as a language, that deepened in the apartment into something I didn't have a previous frame of reference for. We were always touching, not performatively, functionally, the way that people touch when they are each other's primary source of warmth and safety. He would come to stand behind me when I was working and put his chin on my shoulder to read whatever was on my screen, and his weight against my back was so familiar and so right that I would often reach back with one hand and press it to his leg, without looking away from the screen, just to confirm the contact, just to close the circuit. He would fall asleep on the couch with his head in my lap while I worked, and I would rest my free hand on his shoulder or in his hair, a constant absent-minded anchor. We kissed often, not with urgency. Urgency was not the register. They were soft, frequent, incidental kisses, the kind you develop when the person you love is always within reach. When he handed me a mug in the morning, when we passed each other in the narrow space between the desk and the wall, when I had been staring at spreadsheets for too long and he would simply appear beside me and press his lips to my temple, just briefly, just enough to pull me back from the edge of whatever spiral I was descending into. Those kisses were not about desire. They were about anchoring, about saying in the most direct physical language available, "I see you. I'm here. We are still here." But I need to tell you about the other thing, because it is the part of that year that I have been most honest with myself about and least honest about publicly. And in the spirit of this account being a true one, it deserves its space. The separation anxiety was real. I am a person who, prior to the exile, would have described myself as highly self-sufficient. I had been managed and structured since birth, yes, but I had also been groomed for leadership, for solitary decision-making, for the kind of composure that performs best when no one else is in the room. I was not, by any prior evidence, someone who needed another person in order to feel stable. I became someone who needed Ethan in order to feel stable. The transformation was so gradual that I didn't identify it until the morning, about 4 months in, when he had to leave the apartment alone to meet a contact, someone who had reached out about freelance work that required an in-person consultation and who would not meet with both of us, which was an unusual stipulation, but not unusual enough to decline the income. He would be gone for approximately 2 hours. I had known about it for 3 days. I had prepared for it, logistically. I had my own work to occupy me, I had coffee, and I had everything I needed. He kissed me at the door and told me he'd text when he arrived. I nodded. He left. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, the elevator still didn't work, and then silence. I lasted 18 minutes before the interior of the apartment became actively uncomfortable. Not threatening, not dangerous, simply wrong in a sensory way I couldn't rationalize. Like a sound just below hearing that you can feel in your back teeth. I kept looking up from my screen to the part of the room where he usually was, and then experiencing a small jolt of something when he wasn't there. Not dramatic, just wrong. A wrongness that accumulated with every glance until I had to stand up and move around the apartment just to have something for my body to do with the wrongness. He was gone for 1 hour and 53 minutes. I know this precisely because I was tracking it. When his key turned in the lock, I didn't go to the door. I stayed at the desk and watched him come in and hang up his jacket, and he looked at me once and immediately crossed the room and stood beside the desk and put his hand on the back of my neck. Just rested it there, fingers at the base of my skull, and I released a breath I had apparently been holding for 1 hour and 53 minutes. "I know," he said quietly. Just, "I know." He felt it too. That was the part that took me longer to understand. He experienced the same thing when I left. He had become, somewhere in the architecture of our exile, unable to fully locate himself in the world without me in his physical vicinity. And this was not weakness. I want to be clear about that, because the word I am about to use, need, has been weaponized against men like us for their entire lives. The suggestion that needing another person is a vulnerability to be eliminated rather than a design feature to be honored. What we had was not weakness, it was precision. The world had stripped every unnecessary element from our lives until only the essential remained, and the essential, it turned out, was each other. We were not clinging because we had nothing else. We were clinging because we had finally, for the first time in our carefully managed, structurally isolated lives, allowed ourselves to know exactly what mattered. There were nights when the rejection piled high enough that neither of us could hold the other one up, and so we simply lay down together, foreheads touching, Ethan's hands wrapped around mine in the dark, and we breathed. Just breathed. His breath, my breath, the city outside, and the particular quality of quiet that exists when two people have decided they are not going to be afraid alone. That quiet was the foundation of everything we built after it. The turning point was not a dramatic one. It didn't announce itself. It was, in fact, a Thursday evening in the 10th month of our exile, when Ethan was lying on the couch with his feet on my lap going through documents on his laptop, and I was half watching a financial news segment on the small television we'd acquired, and I saw a reporter doing a segment about a restructuring at one of the Weston Group's secondary holdings, a mid-tier logistics company that my father had never cared about enough to pay real attention to, and something shifted in me. Not emotion, not anger, calculus. I turned the television off. Ethan looked up. Something in my expression made him close his laptop. I said, "I know something." He waited. "I know the accounts receivable structure of the Weston Logistics subsidiary better than my father does. I built the model for it when I was 23. He signed off on it and never looked at it again. If someone were to acquire a controlling stake in the 3 vendors that subsidiary depends on for its northern corridor, the whole structure would be vulnerable to renegotiation within a quarter." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Ashford real estate holding in the Eastern District has a refinancing covenant that they've been papering over for 2 years. I wrote the memo myself. It was flagged and buried. If the underlying land assessments were formally contested under the new municipal review framework." I looked at him. He looked at me. The apartment felt, for the first time in 10 months, too small for the idea that had just been born in it. I want to be honest about what we did next, because it requires a kind of honesty that the financial press is not particularly comfortable with. What we built was not built from nothing. It was not a story of pure ingenuity rising against the odds. It was built from knowledge, specific, deep, structural knowledge about how our family's empires actually operated at the plumbing level, knowledge that we had been given access to specifically because we were the heirs, because we were being prepared to lead, because they had spent 2 decades essentially training us in every vulnerability and dependency and quiet corner of the machine. We knew where the weak walls were because we had helped build them. The question was how to use that knowledge without appearing to have it. Because the moment the Weston or Ashford names appeared in any transaction, the game was over. We needed to be invisible. We needed to move in a way that, if anyone looked, pointed nowhere. Ethan had skills in this area that I did not fully appreciate until that year, because in our previous life, discretion had been a social function, managing optics, controlling narratives. In this context, it became something more technical. He built a structure of entities over the following 3 months that I can only describe as a masterwork of corporate architecture. Shell within shell within shell, each one real, each one active, each one leaving just enough of a footprint to pass scrutiny at the level anyone would bother looking. Clean jurisdictions, anonymous principles, nothing that pointed back to us except through a chain of connections so long and so carefully constructed that following it would require both the resources and the motivation that no one yet had reason to muster. I handled the financial strategy, the analysis, the targets, the sequencing. Ethan handled the structure and the execution. We worked in almost perfect silence for weeks at a stretch, across our 2 laptops on the same cluttered desk, occasionally reaching over to show each other something on a screen without explanation, because by that point, we operated on a shared frequency that didn't require full sentences. We started small, deliberately, methodically small. We acquired the vendors, not through our names, through the structure. The logistics subsidiary, just as I had calculated, became negotiable. We renegotiated. We extracted value quietly, invisibly, and we rolled it immediately into the next target. The Ashford Real Estate Holdings refinancing covenant was formally contested in the municipal review process by a real estate consultancy that had no visible connection to either of us. The contest was filed by a mid-level attorney in a city 3 states away who had been engaged through a legitimate intermediary and who had no reason to wonder why the filing mattered. The contest succeeded. The covenant collapsed. The holding had to restructure. We weren't in the room for any of it. We were in the apartment, in the dark, watching the numbers move on screens, and Ethan's hand was in mine on top of the desk, and neither of us said very much. The reinvestment compounded. The compounding was the thing. Every win, no matter how small, was immediately and precisely deployed into the next position. We were not spending. We were not enjoying. We were building something, and we both understood that the building was the point, that what we were constructing was not a business, but a piece of architecture so large that eventually it would cast a shadow. And when it did, everyone who had chosen to see us as nothing would need to look up. By month 22, we had a portfolio that, had anyone known who controlled it, would have alarmed people considerably. By month 30, we were in a position to make moves that couldn't be small anymore. The digital conglomerate, the encrypted, distributed holding vehicle that Ethan had built and that I had loaded with assets and that neither of us had put our names on, was by that point one of the larger anonymous financial actors in the sector. We had expanded out of our family's specific domains and into adjacent ones, acquiring positions in technology, in data infrastructure, in institutional media, in the kind of background architecture that is everywhere and visible to no one because it is too fundamental to be interesting to the people who only pay attention to the surface. We were in the walls, we were in the pipes, we were in the foundation, and we were ready. The night before we moved, we sat on the floor of the apartment with our backs against the bed because the desk was, as always, covered, and Ethan leaned his head on my shoulder, and I rested my cheek against his hair, and we sat there in the dark for a long time. Not talking, not planning, just sitting. I thought about my father's face, the wine glass, the measured voice. I thought about Ethan being taken by the arms. I thought about the gate clicking shut. "Are you scared?" Ethan asked, after a while. "No," I said, which was mostly true. "Are you?" He thought about it. "I'm sad," he said, finally. "I thought I would feel more like winning and less like grieving." I pressed my lips to his temple. I held them there. "You can feel both," I said. "We're allowed to feel both." He turned his face up toward mine, and his expression in the dark was so unguarded, so stripped of every layer of composure he maintained for everything and everyone outside this room, that I felt it in my chest like a physical pressure. "I love you," he said. "I know. I'm counting on it." The morning of the acquisition, I put on a suit I had bought 2 months earlier specifically for this occasion. Not off the rack, but not the bespoke tailoring I had worn before. Something clean, something chosen, something that fit because I had chosen it rather than because it was expected of me. Navy blue. Ethan wore charcoal. We stood in front of the bathroom mirror, the small one, in the studio apartment we had never left, which we had decided to keep until after, as a matter of principle, and he straightened my collar, which didn't need straightening, and I adjusted his cufflink, which was already exactly right, and for a moment we both just looked at each other in the reflection. I don't have a clean word for what that moment was. We took a car we had arranged, not a hired driver, but a professional service, because having our own driver again felt like something to earn rather than something to reclaim. We rode in silence for most of the way, and Ethan's hand was in mine on the seat between us, and neither of us pretended we needed to talk through the strategy again. The strategy was done. It had been done for weeks. What was happening now was simply the moment arriving. The Weston Group board meeting had been called by the new majority shareholder. The Ashford Capital Emergency Governance session had been called simultaneously across town by the same invisible hand. We had arranged them to begin at the same time and to end, we intended, with the same result. But we chose the Weston boardroom first. I had specific reasons. The building was one I had walked through hundreds of times. The lobby had a particular smell, climate-controlled air, and the faint ghost of whatever flowering plants the interior design team kept in the atrium. And when I stepped through the revolving door and the smell hit me, something moved in me that I had not fully anticipated. Not sentiment exactly, Recognition. The body remembering a place it had known before it understood that the place was not what it appeared to be. Security didn't stop us. We were listed on the agenda. The new majority shareholders' representatives had every right to attend. The front desk attendant, young, unfamiliar, someone hired after our time, looked up our names on the approved list, found them, and nodded us through. We went up alone. The elevator was faster than the one in our apartment had ever been in the periods when it worked at all. The boardroom doors were heavy. They always had been, dark walnut, polished, fitted with handles that were heavier than they needed to be because weight conveys authority, and my father understood the semiotics of rooms. I put my hand on one of those handles. Ethan was one step behind me on my left, close enough that his shoulder was nearly against mine, and when I glanced at him, he gave me one measured, slow nod. I opened the door. The room was full. 8 board members, 3 senior executives, 2 legal advisors, and a corporate secretary at the far end taking notes. They were mid-conversation when we entered. Apparently, the nature of the meeting had been described to them only as an urgent shareholder update, not specifically who would be walking through the door, and the conversation did not stop immediately. There was a half-second delay while the room registered us. Then it stopped. I had imagined this moment so many times, in so many different emotional registers, over 3 years. I had imagined it with fury, with cold satisfaction, with grief, with the specific pleasure of irony. Standing in the actual room, in the actual moment, I felt something cleaner than any of those. It was clarity, a precise, total absence of ambiguity. My father was seated at the head of the table. Of course he was. Reginald Weston was always at the head of the table. He was 71 years old, and he was still the most composed man I had ever seen in a room, and when his eyes found mine across the length of that boardroom, I watched the composure do something I had never seen it do in my entire life. Crack. Not dramatically, not visibly enough that anyone else in the room would have cataloged it as a crack, but I knew his face. I had been looking at his face my entire life, learning to read it the way a sailor reads weather, and I saw it. The infinitesimal widening of the eyes, the brief failure of the carefully maintained stillness around his mouth, the half-second before the mask reassembled itself. He had not expected this. For all his preparation, for all the years of calculated control, this specific outcome had not been a scenario he had prepared for. I walked to the seat on the right side of the table closest to the head, the one that had always, in every board meeting of my childhood, been reserved for the heir apparent. I sat in it. Ethan took the seat beside me, and his knee pressed lightly against mine under the table, and I felt the pressure and let it settle me. One of the legal advisors started explaining the procedural basis of the meeting. I let him finish. I had no interest in disrupting the procedural formality. The formality was useful. It established the legitimacy of what was about to happen in terms the room could not challenge. When the legal explanation was complete, I spoke. I had prepared something, a full statement, properly worded, reviewed by our own legal team, a team that had been retained in layers, professionals who were excellent and who had worked on the transaction without knowing the full picture until 48 hours prior. I had the statement on my phone. I had rehearsed it. I set the phone face down on the table and spoke without it. Because what I wanted to say was not a statement, it was a truth, and truths are diminished by preparation. I looked at my father. Directly, across the length of that table, past the crystal water glasses and the leather-bound agendas and the men and women who had spent their careers serving this empire, I looked at my father with everything I had. Not anger, not performance, not rehearsed emotion, just the total unmediated reality of who I had become in the 3 years since he'd watched me walked out of a gate with a bag and a closed door. "You said I was a stain," I said. My voice was level, entirely level, on a 100-year-old name. You said that, and you believed it was a punishment. You believed that by attaching that word to me, you were defining what I was. You were taking something from me. You were finishing something. I paused. Not for effect, because the next part was the part that mattered, and I wanted to give it the space it deserved. You were teaching me. You just didn't know what the lesson was. The room was so quiet I could hear the corporate secretary's pen stop moving. Ethan and I are the new majority shareholders of the Weston Group. We are also, as of 40 minutes ago, the controlling interest in Ashford Capital and its affiliated holdings. The documentation is in front of your legal team. The governance transfer is procedurally complete. There is no mechanism available to you to contest it, and the advisors in this room will confirm that. My father had not moved. He was still performing composure. I watched him perform it, and for the first time in my life, I felt the performance clearly for what it was. Not strength, but its simulation. A man who had spent his entire life choosing power over everything, including his son, sitting in the chair he had cared about more than me, now holding that chair with both hands while the floor shifted beneath it. "I'm not here for an apology," I continued. "I'm not here for recognition. I'm not here because I need you to understand what you did. I don't require your understanding. I don't require anything from you," which is a sentence that I would like you to sit with because I think it's one you've never heard directed at you before. I picked up the phone, set it back down, left it where it was. You traded us for a name. You traded your son, your heir, the person you spent 30 years claiming to be building this for the maintenance of a name that is now mine. The board seat is mine. The building with your name on the glass facade is mine. The 100-year-old legacy that you chose over me is mine. Not as an inheritance, as an acquisition. The word landed in the room the way it was meant to. Zero forgiveness, I said. I want you to hear that clearly. Not anger, not hatred. Zero forgiveness is different from both of those. Anger passes. Hatred consumes the person who carries it. Zero forgiveness is simply a structural reality, a recognition that what was done is complete and not subject to revision. There is no path from this room to a different past. There is only this present, in which the son you called a stain on your name has come back to tell you that the name is now his problem to do with as he sees fit. I stood. Ethan stood with me. Perfectly synchronized because we had been in the same room for 3 years and we moved the way people move when they have stopped having to think about coordination. "Our legal team will be in touch regarding the transition timeline," I said. "I suggest full cooperation. It will be better for everyone." I looked at my father one last time. He was looking back at me, and his face had achieved something I had never seen on it before. Not the composure, not the performance, not the careful blankness he deployed in difficult negotiations. Something raw. Something that in another man, in another context, I might have called loss. I did not relent. I carried the zero forgiveness with me the way you carry the truth, not as a weapon, but as a fact. It is simply what it is. The work was done. The walls they had thrown us out to die outside of were ours. I turned away from my father's face. Ethan and I walked out of that boardroom together, and the door swung shut behind us with its characteristic heavy finality. And in the elevator, on the way down, I pressed my face into the side of his neck and stood there, in the steel box between floors, just breathing him in. His warmth, his steadiness, the particular combination of cedar and clean air that has always meant safety to me, while he wrapped both arms around me and held on. Neither of us said anything until we reached the lobby. Then Ethan said, very quietly, against my hair, "It's ours now." "Yeah," I said. "What do you want to do with it?" And he pulled back to look at me, and his smile was the real one, the small and slow one that reaches his eyes. And he said, something they never would have thought of. There is a thing that happens when people hear the arc of our story, the exile, the shadow years, the takeover, that I understand but do not share. They expect the ending to be triumphant in a particular way, spacious, separate. The natural conclusion of two men who built an empire is that they would inhabit it expansively, with all the private offices and dedicated floors and individual spheres of influence that power of that magnitude traditionally demands. We do not work that way. Our primary office is on the 41st floor of what was, until we renamed it, the Weston Group Headquarters Building. It is a very large room. I designed it specifically with an architect who came to understand, over the course of several revision sessions, that the core requirement was not aesthetics or acoustics or natural light, though all of those matter. The core requirement was that it had to accommodate two complete and fully functional workstations, separate desks, separate screens, separate storage, separate phone systems, within a space where, if either of us reached across without standing, our hands would meet. We are never more than a desk's width apart when we are working. This is not a romantic gesture, though it contains romance. It is not a compromise, though it required design thinking. It is simply the accurate expression of what we are. We have never recovered from the studio apartment in the sense that recovery implies that something was wrong. We discovered, in 400 square feet, that proximity is not a limitation, but an infrastructure. That knowing someone is within reach is not a dependency, but a resource, a renewable one, freely available, that requires only the honesty to acknowledge that you want it. We are married now, quietly, legally, in the presence of a judge and two witnesses who worked for our legal team and who were paid to be discreet, which was not entirely necessary because neither of us had interest in concealment, but old habits in service of protection die slowly. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Ethan cried during exactly one of those 11 minutes, which was the minute where the judge asked him if he took me for the rest of his life, and he paused before answering, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of the words settling into him as real. And when the pause produced tears, he didn't seem embarrassed by them, just surprised, in the way you are surprised by rain when you know it is coming, but still feel it. I did not cry. I held his hand through the pause and watched his face, and the feeling in my chest was not sadness and not quite joy, but something adjacent to both. A deep, structural recognition, the way you feel when something finally, irrevocably settles into place. I wear a ring. He wears a ring. We didn't announce it publicly, not because we are ashamed, but because nothing about our public lives has ever required external validation, and we saw no reason to begin. The people who needed to know were told. The people who didn't need to know eventually read it somewhere, because things always leak. And by then, neither of us had the particular energy for caring what anyone thought. What I want to tell you about our life now, the real life, beneath the acquisitions and the restructurings and the board meetings and the interviews that financial press runs every few months, with headlines that get increasingly creative about our trajectory, is the texture of the ordinary. Because that is the part that the empire narrative doesn't make room for, and the part that I find most remarkable about what we've built. Every morning is still slow. I still wake up to find Ethan already awake, facing me in the gray light, and he still smiles that small, real smile, and I still reach for him before I reach for my phone. We have a kitchen now, a real one, with actual appliances and sufficient counter space, but we still drink coffee before we speak. There's an unspoken agreement about the first 10 minutes of the day that predates the apartment and will outlast both of us probably. The first 10 minutes are just for being in the same room. He still puts his chin on my shoulder to read my screen, even though both our workstations are large enough that he could simply ask me to project something. The chin on the shoulder is not about the content of the screen. The chin on the shoulder is a communique, and its content is, I am here, and you are here, and that is the foundation of the rest of today. We still have the separation anxiety, both of us. I am not going to pretend that success cured it. What success did was remove most of the circumstances that required separation. We no longer have to send one person to a meeting that the other cannot attend. We go together. We walk into rooms together. The world has learned to read us as a single entity when it comes to professional engagements, which suits us precisely because it is accurate. When scheduling requests come in for a meeting with Carter Weston, our team's response is standardized. Meetings are with both of them or with neither. There are still, occasionally, moments when one of us has to be somewhere the other cannot follow. Medical appointments, a conversation that is genuinely only relevant to one of us. Those moments still produce the same low-grade wrongness in me that they did in the apartment, the looking up from the screen and experiencing a jolt at the absence, the slight irrational increase in my attentiveness to my phone, the particular relief of the door opening and his footsteps in the hall. He knows all of this. He does all of this. We have had the conversation exactly once, early in the apartment years, in which we acknowledged it fully and honestly and named it without apology, and we have not needed to have it again, because naming it once was sufficient. It is simply part of what we are, a feature, not a flaw. The body knows what matters. What I think about sometimes, when I'm sitting in the large office in the late afternoon, with my work mostly done and Ethan still fully engaged in whatever thread he's pursuing, he works longer than I do in the evenings, his concentration deepens as the day progresses rather than depleting, is the view from the window, the skyline, the buildings, the names carved into glass facades, including some that now are ours and some that belonged to other families, and some that belonged to no one's name in particular because we had them changed. Our families owned the skyline, past tense, inherited ownership, maintained by inertia, name recognition, and the complacency that power cultivates in the people who have always had it. We own it differently. We own it as proof, not of our family's legacy, but of its failure. The failure of the belief that a name is worth more than a person, that an empire is worth more than the human beings it produces, that legacy is a thing to be protected rather than something you build with your own hands out of whatever materials are available to you, including the ones that look like nothing from the outside and are everything from the inside. We built this out of a studio apartment and 2 laptops and the specific indelible knowledge that we had each other. That is the actual founding document of everything we have made. Not the shell companies, not the acquisition strategy, not the legal architecture or the encrypted conglomerate or the hostile takeover that the financial press still periodically runs retrospectives on as though they are going to find something we haven't already accounted for. The founding document is we are each other's. All of this, the 41st floor, the 43 buildings with the name on the glass, the portfolio that extends into sectors our fathers never thought to enter, the board seats and the governance rights, and the clean, irrefutable, legally unassailable fact that the empire our families thought they were protecting from us now belongs to us. All of this is a consequence of that document, not the other way around. Ethan looks up from his screen sometimes and finds me looking at him, and he raises an eyebrow very slightly, a private expression that means, "What are you thinking about?" And I say, "Nothing." Because it isn't nothing, but it doesn't need to be a sentence. The sentence is too small for it. The sentence is, I am thinking about the fact that everything was worth it, and I would do every day of it again without revision, and the only thing I regret is that I couldn't have told the version of myself standing outside that gate with a bag that it was going to be not just fine, but more than fine. More than any version of fine that the estate or the legacy or the 100-year-old name ever had the imagination to contain. But that's too long, so I say nothing. And he looks at me for a moment longer, reading something in my face that he has developed a fluency in reading over years of proximity, and then he turns back to his screen with the small, slow smile. We stay in the office past the point when the support staff have gone home, and the city does its evening thing outside the window, lights coming on in towers, the skyline shifting from silver to amber to the dark orange wash of a city that never fully sleeps, and eventually Ethan closes his laptop and rolls his chair over to my side of the desk and leans against my shoulder. And I don't move to make room. I just let him lean. He says, "Ready?" He means, "Are you ready to go home?" Which is now a real home, with rooms and a kitchen and a bed that is large enough for both of us with room to spare. Though we have never used the room to spare, because the point was never the space. 5 minutes, I say. He doesn't move. He stays leaning against my shoulder. His eyes close. He is not asleep. I know what Ethan asleep looks like, and this is not it. He is simply resting for a moment in exactly the place he most wants to be. I save my work. I close my laptop. I do not move. We stay like that for more than 5 minutes. The city does its thing outside. The skyline holds all its names, including ours. The empire hums its quiet hum, and servers and accounts and structures and holdings too complex and too distributed to be understood by anyone who doesn't already live inside it. We live inside it together. That is, in the end, the only fact that has ever mattered. Our families called us stains. Stains on the name, on the legacy, on the 100-year-old idea that blood is more important than love and lineage is more important than the people it produces. They said this with composure and wine glasses and white peonies and pre-packed bags, and they believed it with the full conviction of people who have never been required to examine their convictions. We took their conviction, and we built it into a foundation. And then we built on top of it, and on top of that, and we kept building until what they had tried to bury us under became the ground we stand on. The stains on the name came back and bought the name. And the name, the legacy, the empire, the skyline, the 100 years of carefully maintained reputation is now nothing more than an asset in a portfolio managed by two men who love each other with a totality that their families never understood and could not have contained, who built everything they have in service of nothing except the right to be what they are without apology, who share an office because they do not need to perform independence, who reach across desks to confirm contact, who press foreheads together in the dark, who panic quietly when separated and settle completely when reunited, who are clingy and devoted and ruthless and soft and married and unfinished and permanent, who are, above all else, each other's. Zero forgiveness for the people who tried to make that something to be ashamed of. Infinite gratitude for the exile that proved it true. The end.